I first noticed the flags on a Tuesday morning. Little orange and pink triangles fluttered in the breeze, staked deep into the soil of my upper alfalfa field, like someone had dropped candy wrappers across the grass. Scout, my old border collie, barked and sniffed at them curiously as we walked the fence line. I bent down, pulled one up, and saw a number scrawled on it in black Sharpie, Section 3, Pipe Route. Pipe Route. I stood there for a long while, just turning the flag over in my hand, trying to make sense of it. No one had asked for permission to survey. No one had called. There hadn't been any meetings, any letters, any door-to-door knocks. My property sat outside the HOA district lines, always had. That's why I bought it. After retiring from the fire department, I sold our suburban house and moved here to this stretch of open land, 36 acres of rolling pasture, a farmhouse built in 1947, and a small lake my father once dredged and shaped by hand. That lake was his pride. He even lined it with stone from the quarry and built a little valve system to control the flow into the lower fields. It had fed our irrigation for decades, and now these strangers were hammering plastic flags into the earth like it didn't belong to anyone. I walked the length of the field and found more flags, dozens forming a crude line that sliced through the alfalfa, then curved toward the back of the property near the edge of the woods. Scout growled low as we reached the tree line. He always got tense around unfamiliar scents, and today his hackles were up. There were tire tracks here still fresh in the mud. I called the sheriff's office. "Sir," the woman said, after taking down my information, "if they didn't have your permission to be on your property, that's trespassing. I'll send someone out." That afternoon, Deputy Holloway rolled up the gravel drive in his cruiser, took a look at the flags, and made some calls. He seemed genuinely surprised. "Looks like it's part of a new infrastructure build approved by the High Ridge Meadows HOA. They're running some kind of utility line, maybe water or sewer, from their new Phase 2 construction through here," he said, frowning. "But your land doesn't fall under HOA jurisdiction. You think I don't know that?" I said, trying to stay calm. "They didn't just step over the line. They marched a whole parade through it." Holloway promised to write up a report and told me to document everything. I spent the rest of the day walking the entire eastern boundary, taking photos flag by flag. By Thursday, the survey flags had multiplied. There were now metal stakes driven into the soil marking deeper points. Someone had laid spray-painted lines, 2 bright blue and red slashes right across my ryegrass. I posted "no trespassing," private property signs every 100 feet. I even installed a game camera in a tree overlooking the route. And yet on Friday morning they came. Bulldozers. 2 of them. Yellow beasts with steel jaws escorted by a white pickup truck that bore the HOA's logo on the door, High Ridge Meadows Development Committee. The driver stepped out and looked around like he owned the place. I didn't wait. I climbed into my truck, drove across the pasture, and parked right in their path. The foreman, a wiry guy with sunglasses and a clipboard, strolled up like this was a casual disagreement. "You can't be here," I said through the window. He gave me a look. "Sir, we've been authorized to begin trenching." The HOA filed the necessary easements through municipal planning. I opened the door, stepped out, and squared up to him. "Not on this land, they didn't. This is private property. I never signed an easement. There is no recorded access here." He held up the clipboard. "Look, I don't make those decisions. You'll need to talk to the board president. Then call her, right now." The man looked annoyed but stepped away to make a call. I waited, fists clenched at my sides. Scout sat at my heel, quiet now, watching. 10 minutes passed. The machines idled. Finally, he came back. "They say it's already approved and funded. If you interfere, you could be liable for delays." I laughed once, sharp, bitter. "Let me be real clear. You dig 1 inch into my soil and you'll be liable for trespass. Civil court. You understand me?" He didn't respond. He just waved at the machines and motioned for them to back off. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch sipping coffee gone cold, staring toward the eastern horizon where the flags still fluttered. Something deeper than frustration simmered inside me. It was the feeling I used to get at a fire scene, when I knew something wasn't right, when you felt heat from the floor before the smoke ever rose. I didn't know what the HOA was really up to, but I could feel the pressure building, and something told me they weren't going to stop. It happened at dawn. I woke to the sound of metal shrieking against metal, an unnatural ripping groan that vibrated through the floorboards of my old farmhouse. Scout barked wildly from the back porch. I shot up, pulled on my jeans, and barely remembered to grab my phone before charging out the front door. What I saw nearly brought me to my knees. A bulldozer was already in the middle of my alfalfa field, tearing a wide trench through the soil. The freshly turned earth bled green and brown as the sharp blade plowed through the rows I had nurtured for the past 4 seasons. The tall stalks that had been just weeks from harvest now lay in mangled piles, crushed and forgotten. Another dozer followed behind, deeper in the field, making its way toward the wooded edge. There was no warning, no knock on the door, no letter, just brute force and diesel engines. I jumped into my truck, floored it across the gravel, and drove straight into their path again. This time, I didn't stop 20 feet away. I parked directly in front of the lead dozer's blade, stepped out, and stood my ground. The operator cut the engine. Dust swirled around us. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the white HOA pickup roll up once more. This time, it wasn't just the foreman. The woman who stepped out of the passenger seat wore a red blazer and a laminated badge clipped to her chest, Candace Willoughby, HOA president. She walked toward me like I was a bump in her well-planned morning. "Mr. Mallory," she said, tilting her head, "you were informed of the easement filings. Your refusal to acknowledge them doesn't change the legal standing. This infrastructure is critical to our community's water distribution." I took a deep breath and pointed behind her. "That is not an easement. That is private farmland. And you're going to pay for every foot you just destroyed." Candace smiled, not politely, condescendingly. "This land is designated as a utility corridor under the Municipal Expansion Code. Section B14. Your resistance has been noted. Noted by Who Your Clipboard Gang, there is no recorded easement on this land. And unless you can produce a deed, you are trespassing. Period." She stepped closer, her heels sinking slightly into the soft, churned-up earth. "We are acting in the interest of public utility. You can take this up with city planning, but I assure you we have their support." "That's funny," I said, pulling out my phone because I already spoke to the planning office. "They didn't even know you'd crossed into my property line. You filed permits for Phase 2 of High Ridge Meadows, but none of them include this land. You're banking on intimidation and hoping I'm too old or too tired to fight back." Her expression flickered just slightly, a crack in the porcelain. "I suggest," she said coldly, "you remove your vehicle and allow our contractors to finish the trenching. Or we'll be forced to file an obstruction complaint and seek damages for delay." Scout growled beside me. I reached down and placed a calming hand on his head, never breaking eye contact with Candace. "You want to fight," I said. "You've got one." By noon, I had already contacted my attorney. His name was Russell Drake, a veteran land use lawyer out of Helena. I hadn't spoken to him in over a decade, not since he helped my father stop a mining company from diverting runoff through our pasture. But he remembered our family. And more importantly, he knew the boundaries of our land like the back of his hand. When I sent him the photos, the drone shots I'd captured last month, and the coordinates from my property deed, he went quiet on the phone for a few seconds. "They're deep in violation," he finally said. "That pipeline route cuts nearly 600 feet into your property. No registered easement, no eminent domain order, nothing. They're bluffing, and if we move quickly, we can stop this before they go underground." "Good," I said, "because I'm not letting them bury a single inch." He told me to file a temporary restraining order with the county court and send cease and desist letters to both the HOA board and their contractors. While he handled the legal side, I began documenting every inch of destruction they'd already caused. Flattened irrigation lines, disrupted soil, and a broken cattle fence along the west lot. That night, I stood at the edge of the trench in silence. The air was cold, and a light mist was rising off the ground, curling around the broken stalks of alfalfa, like ghost smoke. I looked up at the stars, that wide Montana sky that had always calmed me before. But now I just felt invaded. This land had been in my family since the 1950s. My grandfather worked. Yet my father added the lake, and I, after a lifetime of city firefighting, came here to preserve it. It wasn't just property. It was legacy. It was peace. It was mine. And now, a faceless board with shiny blazers and laminated badges thought they could turn it into a highway for water they didn't even own. But I had an advantage they hadn't considered. I walked the ridge that night, past the orchard, past the lower barn, until I reached the lake. Moonlight shimmered across its surface, still, untouched. The same water that flowed down to the HOA development now trickled through a man-made valve my father installed decades ago. A single turn of that valve could change the flow entirely. They didn't just dig through my crops. They dug their own grave. The cease and desist letter was delivered on Monday morning by courier. I made sure of it. Russell drafted it over the weekend, packed it with legal citations from state property law, water rights precedents, and historical plat maps that showed without ambiguity that my land was well outside the jurisdiction of the High Ridge Meadows HOA. We even included a digital map overlay showing the trench line running directly through my fields. There was no room for spin, no gray area. It was a crystal clear violation. By noon, I drove to the HOA office myself. Their administration building was a repurposed clubhouse off Birch Hollow Drive, a glassy too-modern structure with slate siding and a fake waterfall out front. The place looked like it was trying too hard to scream authority. I walked in wearing boots still crusted with the dirt they'd torn up. At the front desk, a 20-something in a High Ridge Meadows polo shirt blinked at me when I gave my name. I think Ms. Willoughby is in a board meeting. I set the manila envelope on the counter. You can give her this, and tell her she has 24 hours to get that equipment off my land before this becomes a criminal trespass case. The kid took it like it was radioactive. I turned and walked out without waiting for a response. I thought that might make them reconsider, but the next morning they sent more machines. A drilling crew arrived just after sunrise. Scout barked frantically as we watched from the porch. A narrow drill rig rumbled along the trench, followed by a water tanker marked municipal grade, Ridge Infrastructure. Two workers began installing pipe sections 4-foot lengths of polyvinyl blue, branded with the city supplier's name. It was like they were daring me to act. I walked out there again, my boots pressed into the soft, torn-up earth. This time I brought printouts of the court filing we'd submitted for an emergency injunction late the night before. The foreman refused to stop the crew. "You're not the city," he said, "and until the court tells us otherwise, we're working. Then you're not just trespassing. You're building without a permit. That's felony level in this state." He shrugged. "Talk to your HOA." "I'm not in your HOA," I snapped. "Never have been, never will be." Later that day, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Candace Willoughby. Her voice was clipped and formal, like she was reading from a press release. "Mr. Mallory," she said, "I understand you're continuing to interfere with the approved pipeline project. I'd like to remind you that High Ridge Meadows has secured conditional consent from city planning to extend services for our new homes. This includes water infrastructure that may temporarily cross adjacent rural plots." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the phone. "Temporarily cross," I said. "Lady, you've trenched 600 feet into my land. You've uprooted my crop yield for the season. And now you're installing permanent pipe. There's nothing temporary about this." Her tone sharpened. "You are actively obstructing a municipal service line that benefits over 400 homes. Do you really want to be known as the man who cut off clean water to families?" I froze. There it was, the playbook. Shift the blame. Guilt trip the landowner. Paint me as the heartless recluse with a vendetta against progress. I steadied myself. "You built a pipeline to draw water from a lake you don't control," I said. "That lake was hand-dug by my father in 1961. It sits entirely on my land. I own the upstream source, which means you're pumping water you have no legal right to touch." Silence. Then sarcastic laughter. "Oh, that little pond," she said. "Please. That's hardly a lake. The board assumed it was part of the regional watershed. Besides, water rights don't apply the way you think they do." The board consulted professionals. "You might want to fire them," I said, my voice low, "because the dam's intake valve is under my control. And if I decide to shut it off, that municipal pipeline of yours is going to run real dry. I strongly advise against any hostile action," she snapped. "That would be considered intentional sabotage of a public utility, and we would seek both criminal and civil charges." "You've got 24 hours, Ms. Willoughby," I said. "Pull back your crews, or the water stops." I hung up. That night I walked the shoreline of the lake. The air was still. The stars shimmered above, reflected perfectly on the glassy water. I stood at the valve station. My father built a simple concrete box with a rusted metal wheel on top. A few feet of chain-link fence surrounded it, mostly symbolic now. This lake had fed our crops, our cattle, and our home for over 60 years. Every inch of it was documented in the county's original water rights records. My father had fought to keep it private when the county tried to annex the land in the 80s. He won. I still had the stamped documents in my filing cabinet. They thought I was some country fool who wouldn't understand the law. But I was raised by a man who understood boundaries and how to defend them. By the time I walked back to the house, I had made up my mind. No more warnings, no more calls. If they didn't pull back by morning, the valve would close, and the pipeline would go bone dry. At first light, I walked back to the lake. The fog was still clinging to the surface like a veil, soft and white. The air held that damp chill, unique to Montana mornings, somewhere between memory and muscle. I had walked this path more times than I could count. As a boy chasing frogs along the shore, as a teenager hauling buckets of gravel to reinforce the embankment with my father, as a man returning from the city, and all its noise hoping to find some quiet here again. But this morning it didn't feel quiet, it felt waiting. I crouched beside the concrete valve chamber. It had rusted more than I liked, another thing I'd meant to repair but always pushed off. The wheel still turned with a groan. I gave it a half rotation just enough to feel the resistance of water pressure humming beneath the surface. If I turned it clockwise fully shut, the flow would stop. Not just to the lower irrigation fields, but to the newly trenched line that HOA crews had embedded into my soil without permission. The board hadn't known the lake was fed by spring. It wasn't a runoff pond or a rain catchment like they might have assumed. The spring rose from a natural aquifer that ran beneath my land and had been capped and channeled decades ago by my grandfather and great-uncle, both engineers, who understood how to shape terrain. That spring, combined with the dam's control valve, meant I had leverage that no modern permit or map could override. But that wasn't just power, it was responsibility. I hesitated. Not out of fear, but caution. If I shut the water off too fast, pressure could rupture their unfinished pipe system and flood the construction site. If I waited too long, they'd finish the connection and tie into the main city grid, which would complicate everything. So I gave them one more hour. In that time, I called Russell and filled him in. He barely let me finish before responding. They didn't get clearance from the water control board, he asked. Nope. And no tap-in permit for a private source. They called it a pond, I said. He groaned. That's a lake. You have proof of rights. Original plat map, handwritten logs, and the 1987 court ruling from Dad's case. It's all there. He whistled low. Then do it. We'll file a notice with the state as soon as it's closed. That lake is your property. Your system. They can't draw from it without consent. They're done. And I did. I returned to the valve and gripped the wheel. The metal was slick with condensation, but I turned it anyway. Slowly, deliberately, until the tension maxed out and the flow was sealed. A faint hiss echoed from the chamber air, displacing water. Then silence. By noon, I got the first call. Not from Candace, from a contractor. Hey, this is Brian from Ridge Infrastructure. We've got a situation. There's no water coming through the feeder pipe. You guys shut down for inspection or something. I let him talk, let the desperation crawl into his voice. Then I said the source is private. It's been cut off. You're pulling from a lake that doesn't belong to you. He went quiet for several seconds. You're the property owner. Correct. Sir, we've got over 30 workers on site. Equipment rented by the hour. We've already installed mainline couplers. If we can't flush the line today, we risk pressure backflow and damage. That's not my concern, I said. You built without permission. You ignored legal notice, and you disrespected my land. I suggest you call your client, the HOA. An hour later, Candace called. Her tone was different this time. No smugness, just clipped frustration. Mr. Mallory, we're experiencing a significant disruption on site. I need you to reopen that valve immediately so we can complete pressure testing. Not going to happen. She exhaled sharply. You don't seem to understand the magnitude of what you're doing. This pipeline is part of a multi-phase development supporting nearly 500 homes. You don't seem to understand that you built a pipeline without owning or leasing the water source. The board was under the impression the lake was part of the regional watershed. Then the board is ignorant, I said, and legally exposed. That's not just trespassing, that's resource theft. There was silence again. Not the kind filled with thinking, the kind filled with calculating. You'll be hearing from our legal team, she said. I already heard from yours. That's why I filed an injunction. That's why the Water Control Board will be getting our filing this afternoon. And that's why every pipe you just laid is going to be excavated and removed. You built your system on a foundation you never owned." Then I hung up. The next morning, news trucks showed up. Somebody, probably one of the workers, had tipped off the local station. They'd heard about the water stoppage, the legal dispute, and the growing tension between an HOA and a lone farmer fighting back. I didn't go out of my way to give an interview, but when they parked near the pasture, I didn't stop them either. One young reporter approached the fence and asked, "Is it true you shut off the entire water supply to High Ridge Meadows?" I thought about my answer carefully. "I shut off the flow from my lake," I said, "because the HOA never asked permission. They didn't file permits. They didn't acknowledge property rights. They just bulldozed their way through and expected nobody to fight back." The clip aired that night. By morning, I had dozens of messages from neighbors, ranchers, and even a few city council members. Most of them said the same thing. "Good for you." I stood on the ridge that evening and looked out at the lake. The fog had lifted. The water was still as glass. Beneath that surface was more than just liquid. It was leverage. It was history. It was proof that sometimes even the smallest corner of forgotten land could bring giants to their knees. And this battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something new. Momentum. It wasn't enough to shut off the water. Not legally. Not permanently. If I wanted this to stick and make sure the HOA never tried anything like this again, I had to get ahead of them. Fast. Russell agreed. "Candace Willoughby's bluffing," he said, pacing his office on speakerphone. "But bluffing doesn't mean harmless. If they get enough time to finish that connection to the main municipal line, they can argue the damage is irreversible, and then you're stuck in a long-term settlement mess. I don't want money," I told him. "I want them off my land, every inch of it. Then it's time to file the cease and desist, the emergency injunction, and loop in the county court. You've got the deed. You've got aerial photos. And thanks to your father's record keeping, we've got water rights that date back before the HOA was even formed." "Good," I said. "Let's bury them in paperwork before they try to bury more pipe." We filed the cease and desist at 9:04 a.m. on Thursday. Russell had arranged for same-day processing through the county clerk, an old friend of his from law school days, who still ran the civil filings desk. Along with it, we submitted, and the 1987 ruling that confirmed my father's exclusive water rights over the lake. A notarized survey map showing the pipeline trench cutting into my private land. Witness statements from 2 neighboring farmers who saw the machines enter. Drone footage from my DJI time-stamped and GPS tagged. It was bulletproof. By mid-afternoon, the clerk's office stamped the injunction and handed it to a county sheriff to serve directly to the High Ridge Meadows HOA. I wasn't present for the delivery, but Russell was. He said when the deputy walked into the boardroom and handed Candace the thick folder, she turned a shade of pale that didn't quite match her lipstick. Someone on her team whispered, "Can they do that loud enough for the whole office to hear?" Russell just smiled and said, "Yes, they can." But I wasn't taking any chances. That evening, I stood at the valve house again. I'd brought my bolt cutters and 2 padlocks. I replaced the old rusted chain with a new stainless steel one and added a second lock just in case. When I got home, I sent an email to the Montana Department of Natural Resources, attaching all the water records and land boundaries, including the court order. I asked for a formal recognition of the lake's exempt status from public utility use. Within 24 hours, they responded. Confirmed. Lake Mallory is registered as a private water body under 1961 records with no downstream obligations to community services. Your cutoff was within legal rights. I stared at the screen for a long time. Lake Mallory, that's what they called it. I'd never heard it that way before. My father never named it, he just called it the lake. But somehow seeing that name on an official government letter made something in my chest crack open. Not with sadness, with pride. It wasn't just dirt and water, it was legacy. And I was finally protecting it the way it deserved. 2 days passed before I heard anything from Candace. This time she didn't call, she showed up. It was early morning. I'd just come back from the barn checking on the fencing damage. Scout started barking before I even saw the vehicle. A sleek black Mercedes parked half on the gravel shoulder. She got out in heels again. Who the hell wears heels to a farm? "Mr. Mallory," she said, walking up with a manila folder in her hands. "I'd like to discuss a resolution." "Good," I said. "The resolution is get your pipeline off my land." She forced a smile. You've made your point. But our board is under pressure to complete Phase 2 before the fiscal quarter ends. I think there's a mutually beneficial path forward here. I cross my arms. There's not. We're prepared to offer you a one-time easement fee, she said, opening the folder in exchange for long-term access. $20,000 plus property repair costs. I laughed out loud. 20 grand. You destroyed 4 acres of crops, chewed through a private fence, and trespassed across a legacy that 3 generations built. You think a check fixes that? Her jaw clenched. This could have been resolved quietly. You had your chance, I said. You mocked me, threatened me. You assumed I'd roll over because I was just a farmer outside your jurisdiction. Well, now you've got a court date. She shifted tactics. Mr. Mallory, if the pipeline is delayed much longer, we're going to have families without water. Children, seniors, disabled homeowners. Do you really want to be responsible for that? There it was again. The guilt. The emotional blackmail. But it didn't land this time. I pointed up the ridge. You see that line of flags? That's where your trench ends. And just 20 feet beyond that, that's the boundary line. You could have asked. You could have rerouted. But you didn't. You charged ahead thinking no one would stop you. And now I'm stopping you. Candace sighed. So we're doing this the hard way. No, I said. You did it the hard way. After she left, I called Russell. He chuckled when I told him about her offer. 20,000. They must be desperate. But the good news is their clock just ran out. Judge Halverson approved the injunction this morning. The HOA is now legally prohibited from performing any further construction on or across your land, and they have 72 hours to remove the pipe or face daily fines. How much per day? 2,000, climbing to 5 if they don't comply by the end of the week. I felt the tension bleed from my shoulders for the first time in days, but I wasn't smiling. Not yet, because this wasn't just about punishing them. It was about setting a precedent. If they could get away with building through one farm, they'd do it again. To someone older, someone without a lawyer, someone without a lake. They thought I was just one man. And they were right. But one man with leverage is all it takes. I waited until dawn. The injunction had been served, the cease and desist had been ignored, and the deadline was ticking. HOA trucks still sat parked near the edge of my pasture. And despite the court order, I had a gut feeling they were planning to finish the job before any real enforcement showed up. People like Candace Willoughby always gambled on power moving slowly, and they'd been right most of their lives. But I wasn't about to let them steal another drop from my lake. So at 5:41 a.m., with the mist still curling low over the fields, I walked the path alone to the Lake Valve station. Scout didn't follow this time. He must have known I needed the moment to myself. I stood for a long minute beside the wheel. I could hear the quiet gurgle beneath the concrete, the movement of water through the subterranean channel my father and grandfather built by hand. They designed it to feed a network of irrigation ditches that had kept this land green through years of drought fire season and bureaucratic incompetence. That system wasn't just functional, it was sacred, and it had been violated. I turned the valve, clockwise, a full rotation and a half. The hiss of pressure escaping the pipe echoed across the still water. Then silence. The flow stopped. The effects weren't instant, but by noon I knew it was working. I was sitting on my porch drinking coffee when I heard it shouting, engines revving, and the unmistakable metallic grind of someone trying to reverse engineer their own mistake. I walked out to the edge of the property past the oak tree that marked the eastern boundary. There, just beyond the flags, the HOA crews had gathered in a tight knot of chaos. One of the backhoes sat idle. Workers surrounded an exposed section of pipe, arguing in tight circles. A man in a neon vest held a pressure gauge in the air and kept shaking his head. Candace herself stood nearby, her red blazer now replaced by something more functional, still out of place for the mud she was standing in. I couldn't hear everything, but I could make out a few things. No draw from the source. Check valve not responding. Systems dry all the way to the main. And then the beautiful one. The whole line's dead. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, arms crossed, and let the scene play out. One of the crew noticed me and elbowed his coworker. Candace looked over. We locked eyes. She started walking toward me, but I raised a hand. Don't bother, I said. I'm not here for another offer. You've made your point, she called out. This isn't a point, I replied. It's a boundary. One you crossed. She walked a little closer. The development will suffer for this. You built your future on stolen land, and borrowed water. That's not development. That's delusion. Her lips thinned into a line. I suppose you think you've won. I smiled, just a little. I think I'm just getting started. She turned and walked away. By sunset, trucks began pulling out. The contractors packed up the equipment. 2 excavators rolled backward out of the trench path, chewing up more pasture, but at least retreating. The pipe segments were cut and removed, stacked on flatbeds. I stood by the fence line, watching them erase their crime inch by inch. Russell called just after dark. They're complying, he asked. Yep, moving out now. He exhaled. Good. Because I just heard from the judge's clerk, Candace tried to appeal the injunction. Denied. They've got until Friday to restore the land or face additional sanctions. They won't restore it, I said. They'll leave the soil bare and claim its natural state. We'll push for damages in the civil hearing, Russell said. I'll draft the counterclaim tomorrow. I thanked him and hung up. But I didn't go inside. I walked the ridge path again back to the lake. The moon was high now, reflected in perfect silver over the glassy surface. I sat on the stone bench my father had built, a simple slab resting on 2 boulders. It faced west toward the fields, toward home. And I thought about what that valve had meant. It wasn't just a mechanism. It was a line in the earth, a symbol of what was mine, what I had inherited, and what I refused to let be taken. Most people don't understand land until they've had to fight for it. They think it's just property, dirt, and fences, and taxes. But when your name is tied to the land by decades of sweat, when the trees know your scent, when the water has your grandfather's fingerprints on every stone, it becomes more than that. It becomes identity. The HOA underestimated that. They mistook silence for weakness. They thought rural meant irrelevant. That someone like me, gray-haired, slow-moving alone, would be easy to bulldoze, just like the alfalfa. But I had something they didn't: history, patience, and control of the flow. I had the dam, and I shut it down. The next morning, a letter arrived by courier. Not from the HOA, but from the city attorney's office. Apparently, after the injunction was upheld, Candace tried a new angle, claiming the HOA had municipal utility status and that I had interfered with public infrastructure. The city disagreed. The letter stated clearly that the pipeline was not sanctioned by the Department of Water Resources and that the HOA had no authority to tap into private lakes. Moreover, the city was launching an investigation into improper permitting and unauthorized construction on non-HOA land. I read it twice. Then I laughed, loud and hard, right there on the porch. It was happening. The tide had turned, and all I had to do was turn a wheel. The lawsuit came in a thick cream-colored envelope, hand-delivered by a private courier wearing a tie too tight for his neck. He didn't make eye contact when he handed it over, just held out the envelope like it was radioactive, mumbled, "You've been served," and hurried back to his car. I took it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for a minute. It wasn't unexpected. I knew Candace wasn't the type to surrender quietly. But it still stirred something in my gut, an old fire, the kind I hadn't felt since standing in front of a burning house with a hose in my hand and 5 seconds to decide whether the floor was going to hold. I opened it. High Ridge Meadows HOA versus Mallory Frank. Filed in District Court, Gallatin County. Charges: obstruction of public infrastructure, intentional economic harm, willful sabotage. I read the first 2 pages slowly. Then I flipped ahead through all 76 of them. It was more theater than legal argument. Claims that I had maliciously shut down essential services, endangered the well-being of over 500 families, and caused catastrophic delays in a multi-million-dollar housing project. They included screenshots of their own maps, badly photoshopped to suggest the pipeline ran adjacent to my land, not through it. They didn't even bother to crop out the timestamp on the aerial photo from my drone footage that I had publicly shared. It was a Hail Mary, a desperate one. Still, I wasn't about to underestimate them. I called Russell. "Figured you'd be calling," he said, his voice already sharp with caffeine. "I saw the filing hit the docket this morning. Candace must be panicking. This thing's a mess." "She's trying to get ahead of the optics," I said. "Turn me into the villain." "She's too late. You're already a local hero," he chuckled. "That interview you gave, the clip hit regional news. People are talking about it all over the state. Farmers, ranchers, landowners, they're behind you." I sat down, running a hand over my jaw. Still, they're playing hardball. "Let them," he said. "I've got a surprise for them." The surprise came 2 days later. Russell drove up to the farm himself, wearing a grin, and holding a worn leather-bound folder. "You recognize this?" he asked. I took it, opened the flap, and nearly dropped it. It was my great-grandfather's land grant, signed in ink, dated 1924. It showed the original acquisition of the northern pasture and all the adjacent water rights tied to the lake, including the hand-dug tributary that fed downstream. "This isn't just old paper," Russell said. "This is gold." It had been buried in the archives at the county courthouse, lost behind a shelf full of condemned property deeds. Russell had a clerk pull it when he noticed a reference footnote in the 1987 case file from my dad's fight. "It means," he explained, "not only do you have exclusive control of the lake, you have easement immunity. That means no entity, municipal or otherwise, can construct infrastructure within 200 feet of your lake's natural perimeter without your signed consent." I blinked, and they trenched straight through it. "Dead center," Russell said, tapping the drone map. "They didn't just trespass, they built inside a protected boundary. That's not civil court anymore, Frank. That's criminal exposure." I laughed, the kind of slow, stunned laugh that comes from realizing you've been holding the sword the whole time. "They picked the wrong patch of dirt," I said. "No," Russell replied. "They picked the wrong family." The countersuit went out the next morning. We filed for the following: destruction of crop value over 4 acres, soil disruption and fencing damage, trespassing on protected land with easement immunity, unauthorized tapping of private water resources, emotional distress and reputational harm due to false accusations in public filings. But we didn't stop there. Russell also sent a formal complaint to the state licensing board for civil engineering, citing the contractor who installed the illegal pipeline. He attached evidence of permit falsification, misuse of municipal branding, and violation of the state engineer's code of practice. And because we weren't done twisting the knife, we also reached out to a journalist, an investigative reporter for the Bozeman Sentinel, who had been covering land grabs and HOA corruption cases for years. She called me that night. "I'd love to hear your story," she said. So I told her everything. Not just the facts, but the feeling. The humiliation of being ignored. The fury of watching bulldozers tear through your field like it was nothing more than a patch of dirt. The silence of knowing they thought you were too old, too rural, too out of touch to fight back. She listened, really listened. And she published a piece titled "The Farmer Who Shut Off the Suburbs." It went viral within 48 hours. Comments poured in. So did emails from all across Montana and beyond. People telling me about their own battles with overreaching HOA boards, about how they'd been fined for planting the wrong flowers, for parking in their own driveways, for building tree houses for their kids. It wasn't just me. It was all of us. Candace held a press conference the following week. She stood on a manicured lawn in front of the High Ridge Meadows clubhouse and tried to spin the story. Called me uncooperative, radicalized, and a danger to infrastructure planning. She even accused me of threatening workers, a flat-out lie. But by then the tide had turned. The city issued a formal statement confirming the HOA had not obtained proper water rights. The state opened an ethics review of the HOA board, and the judge scheduled our joint court date for 3 weeks out with a strongly worded note advising the HOA to prepare for a full evidentiary hearing regarding landowner violations. Translation: you're toast. I walked the fence line that night. Scout trotted beside me, tail wagging, as if he understood the war was nearly over. The trench was still visible, bare dirt, snaking across the field like a scar. But it was healing. The grasses had already begun poking through again. Soon I'd lay fresh seed, refill the irrigation ditches, and reset the fencing. But the deeper repair was in me. For the first time in years, I felt seen, respected, not just as a landowner, but as a man, a protector, a legacy bearer. They tried to sue me into silence, but I had the land, I had the law, I had the truth, and I wasn't going anywhere. The courtroom wasn't what I expected. You always imagine marble pillars, soaring ceilings, echoes of justice, bouncing off oak benches. But this one had brown carpets that smelled faintly of disinfectant, humming fluorescent lights, and an old judge with wireframe glasses who looked like he'd rather be fishing. Still, none of that mattered, because this room on this day was where the board of High Ridge Meadows would face something they never saw coming: my family's history. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Russell. Across from us, the HOA had their own legal team, 3 suits, young and smooth-talking, flipping through binders and tapping on iPads like this was going to be a routine procedural walk. Candace Willoughby was there, of course. Red blazer again. That same look on her face as when she first stepped onto my land like this was beneath her. Like we were wasting her time. But when the judge called the session to order and asked both parties to present evidence, it didn't take long before the ground began to shift beneath her. Russell started with the basics. Aerial photos, deed copies, survey maps, testimony from neighbors who saw the trenching without consent. A copy of the emergency injunction we had secured weeks prior. Then he brought out the leather folder. This, he said, laying it gently before the judge, is the original land grant for Parcel 17B, issued to Thomas Mallory in 1924 by the state of Montana. It includes documented water rights and, most importantly, a recorded easement immunity within 200 feet of the lake's natural perimeter. He paused and let that sink in. The judge adjusted his glasses. Easement immunity. Yes, Your Honor. A binding clause that prohibits any public or private entity from constructing infrastructure within the buffer zone unless granted express notarized consent from the landowner. And was such consent ever granted, the judge asked, looking over his spectacles. No, Your Honor, Russell said calmly. Not verbally, not in writing, not ever. The defense attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, that document is nearly a century old. Surely it can't supersede current infrastructure needs. The judge raised a hand. Unless it was revoked or amended, it stands. The age of a contract does not negate its enforceability. He turned back to Russell. You say this document was found in the county archive. Yes. We've also submitted an authenticated copy from the clerk's office. The defense lawyer sputtered something about eminent domain, but the judge waved it off. There is no state-filed eminent domain order attached to this HOA. They are not a municipal authority. They are a private board. He turned a page, and according to the cease and desist, they proceeded with construction after being formally notified. Russell nodded. They ignored the order. They trespassed. They damaged crops fencing and a privately managed water source. And then they attempted to claim the land as part of a utility corridor, a designation which does not exist in the county's official zoning records. The judge looked at Candace. Ms. Willoughby, do you have anything to say before I make a preliminary ruling? She stood, smoothed her blazer, tried to smile. Your Honor, this is a case of misunderstanding. The board acted in good faith, under the impression that the lake in question was part of an unregulated watershed. We deeply regret the confusion, but you continued building after receiving a legal injunction, the judge cut in. That's not confusion. That's willful defiance. Candace's smile faltered. The judge turned his attention back to the bench. Given the overwhelming evidence, including historical land rights, verified water access control, and documented trespass, I'm ruling in favor of Mr. Mallory. The HOA is ordered to pay damages totaling $118,000 for property loss, legal fees, and restoration costs. He paused. In addition, this court is recommending criminal investigation into the filing of fraudulent permits and the possible misuse of municipal branding to justify unauthorized construction. Candace sat down slowly. One of her attorneys whispered something. Her lips tightened, but she didn't argue. The room fell silent. Then Russell leaned toward me and said quietly, It's done. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up. I stood on the steps for a moment, watching the clouds roll in over the hills. Behind me, cameras clicked and reporters called out questions, but I didn't respond. I wasn't there for the headlines. I was thinking about my great-grandfather. He'd built a life from the soil, plowed these fields with draft horses before he ever saw a tractor. Dredged the lake with his sons. Built fences, one post at a time. And somewhere in all that effort, he'd made sure to protect it, not just with blood and labor, but with paper, with signatures, with law. He gave me the tools I needed long before I was born, and I used them. I drove home in silence, no music, just the gravel crunching under my tires as the fields returned to view. The trench had begun to fill in, softened by the autumn rains. Soon I'd have a crew come out and finish grading it. Then I'd reseed, rebuild the fence line, reclaim what they tried to take. But there was one thing I needed to do first. That evening, I returned to the lake. The wind had died. The surface was still again rippling only at the edges where the reeds swayed. I stepped into the valve house, turned the wheel slowly counterclockwise and listened as the pressure hissed back into the pipe. Water flowed again, not to the HOA's pipeline, but to the irrigation ditches, the channels that had fed this land for generations. It wasn't symbolic. It was restoration. Scout lay at my feet, tail thumping once against the concrete as I stood in silence. I thought about the courtroom, about Candace's face when the judge ruled, about the stunned silence from her legal team, and about the hundreds of messages I'd received from strangers thanking me for standing up when so many had felt powerless. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted to be left alone. But when the fight came, I met it, with my back straight, boots planted, and history behind me. That lake had always held power. Now everyone knew it. 3 weeks after the courtroom decision, the official ruling was published in the county register. Normally, such orders collect dust on legal databases and courthouse shelves. But this one did something different. It echoed. Because Judge Halverson didn't just issue a judgment. He issued a precedent. The written opinion, which ran 21 pages long, didn't just affirm my land rights. It directly called out the High Ridge Meadows HOA's conduct as reckless, predatory, and in violation of core property protections under Montana law. It even went so far as to recommend legislative review on how HOAs interact with non-member properties in rural zones. It was the legal equivalent of a lightning bolt, and it didn't take long for the world outside our valley to feel the thunder. Within days, local newspapers ran the headline, "Judge rules against HOA in landmark farmer water rights case." It was picked up by regional outlets in Missoula, Billings, and eventually Denver. A week later, a national agricultural news site featured it in a full article titled "The Lake That Fought Back, Montana Farmer Beats HOA in Court." Emails started flooding in again from other landowners, lawyers, even a few lawmakers. Some wanted advice. Others just wanted to say thank you. "I didn't know we could fight back," one woman from Nebraska wrote. "I've been bullied by our HOA for years," another said. "But your story gave me hope." It felt surreal. I hadn't set out to make headlines. I didn't crave attention. All I wanted was to protect the land. But now, that battle had turned into a banner. And then came the final blow to the HOA's grip: the fines. Under the judge's ruling, the HOA had 72 hours to remove every last inch of illegal pipe backfill the trench and restore my soil or face daily sanctions. They missed the deadline. So the court began levying fines, $2,000 per day. By the end of the second week, they were already up to $26,000 in accumulated penalties. Then came the kicker. The city launched its own investigation into how HOA board members had filed permits under municipal branding. That probe uncovered inconsistencies in their budget reports and backdated filings. In short, they'd lied, on paper, to the government. Candace Willoughby resigned the next day. Her official statement blamed public pressure and media distortion, but the resignation was real. So was the city's decision to temporarily suspend the HOA's authority over infrastructure development pending a full audit. Half the board stepped down within the month. New elections were called. Reform candidates ran on platforms of accountability, transparency, and respecting property lines. I didn't attend the election meeting, but I heard the HOA clubhouse, so proudly built and landscaped to corporate perfection, sat nearly empty that night. People were tired, embarrassed. Some of them even came by my house afterward. One man knocked quietly, middle-aged, graying at the temples with a clipboard under his arm. I just wanted to say he mumbled a lot of us didn't know. About the pipeline. About how far it went onto your land. We just trusted the board. I nodded. That's how they work. Trust first, paperwork later. He looked down. We were wrong. I'm sorry. I told him the truth, apology accepted, but trust that'd take time. That weekend I hosted a bonfire. It started as a quiet idea. Just a few neighbors and friends, a way to mark the end of a long, bitter chapter. But word spread, and by Saturday evening, over 40 people gathered in the pasture near the lake. We grilled burgers. A local bluegrass band played on the flatbed of an old truck. Kids ran barefoot through the grass, no longer fenced off by survey flags or plastic barricades. Russell came too, arriving with a cooler under one arm and a court filing update in the other. "You'll like this," he said, handing me the document. "The judge's ruling has already been cited in 2 other pending cases, one in Kalispell, another in Spokane." I stared at the paper. "It's becoming case law." "Looks that way," he said. "Your fight didn't just protect your land. It set the line in the sand for hundreds of others. We clinked bottles, and I looked out at the lake. It shimmered under the torchlight, calm, whole, untouched now by intrusion. Later that night, as the crowd thinned and the fire died to embers, I walked down to the valve house one last time. Scout followed silent at my side. I placed my hand on the metal wheel. It was still warm from the sun. I didn't need to turn it anymore. The flow was steady. The land was healing. But I gripped it, all the same feeling the steel and history beneath my fingertips. They'd tried to erase me with paper, but I answered with iron. They'd tried to drown my rights in red tape, but I held the high ground literally and legally. And now, for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight lift from my chest. Not just because I had won, but because I refused to lose myself in the fight. A week after the bonfire, I received a letter from the Montana Department of Agriculture. Not a warning, not a fine. A commendation. Mr. Mallory, your recent legal defense of your property and water rights has brought attention to the importance of responsible land stewardship. The department commends your efforts to uphold state law and protect generational farmland from unlawful encroachment. I framed it, not because I needed the recognition, but because that piece of paper, unlike the ones Candace waved around, meant something. It represented a truth that didn't come from bureaucracy, or power, or position. It came from roots, from knowing who you are, what you stand on, and how far you'll go to protect it. And in my case, it came from water. Still, strong, unyielding, just like the man who owned it. The trench was gone by spring. I hired a local crew, young guys, sons of ranchers I'd known since high school. They brought backhoes and dump trucks, but they didn't tear into the land like the HOA had. They worked slowly, respectfully. They asked questions before touching anything. Together we filled in the long scar that once cut across my field like a wound. We packed the soil, tilled it by hand in places, and laid fresh seed. I watched over it like a hawk, but not out of paranoia, out of love. By April, new grass began to sprout. By May, the fence was rebuilt. And by June, it looked like it had never been touched at all. The lake, too, returned to itself. The water ran clear again, fed by the spring beneath, and regulated by the dam's quiet heartbeat. I cleaned the valve housing, repainted the rusted gate, and even replaced the old sign my father once hung, Private Waters, Mallory Property. The letters were hand-carved, and though weather-worn, they still read bold against the grain. Sometimes I'd sit on the stone bench near the bank, coffee in hand, Scout at my feet, just watching the morning mist rise. Not out of worry, not anymore, but gratitude. I had stood my ground, and I was still standing. Word of the case lingered longer than I expected. People continued to write months after the final ruling. A senator's office called asking if I'd be willing to testify about land abuse and HOA overreach. A university professor emailed requesting permission to use my case in her property law class. Even a podcast producer from Texas reached out, offering to dramatize the whole thing for an audience. I turned most of them down, not out of pride, but because the story had already been told, lived, and I didn't need to keep reliving it. The land had been reclaimed, but more importantly so had my peace. One afternoon, I walked the ridge where it all began. The flags, the trenches, the shouting, it felt distant now, like echoes from someone else's life. But the lessons remained etched into every footstep, every breath of wind that moved through the grass. I thought about how close I'd come to losing control, not just of the land, but of my own spirit. There were nights I'd lain awake, rage burning through my chest, like fire through timber. Times I nearly let that anger consume me, but I didn't, because I had the tools. I had the records, yes, the deeds, the rulings, the signatures, but I also had something stronger, a legacy. A blood-deep understanding of what it meant to belong to the land, not just own it, to steward it. Candace never understood that. She saw property as leverage. I saw it as home. She saw the lake as a resource. I saw it as a memory of my father, my grandfather, the hands that built the dam and taught me how to listen to the flow. That's why I won. Not because I was clever, because I cared. The HOA moved on eventually. A new board was elected, quiet, careful folks who stuck to their own side of the line. I haven't heard a word from them in months. No letters, no fines, no trucks pulling up without warning. Sometimes peace comes not with a handshake, but with silence, and I'll take it. Any day. I planted a new orchard on the edge of the field that was once torn apart. Rows of saplings, apples, pears, even a few plums. It'll be years before they bear fruit, but that's the way of the land. You plant, now you wait, you trust. That orchard isn't just a restoration. It's a statement. A promise that this soil will never be surrendered again, not to greed, not to arrogance, not to a piece of paper pushed across a boardroom table, by people who've never worked a day outside air conditioning. Scout passed not long after the orchard went in. 14 years old. He'd seen everything, every step, every storm. I buried him under the oak tree near the lake. I carved a simple stone, faithful, fierce, free, like the land he guarded. Now when I walk the property, it's not with tension in my shoulders or a phone in my hand. I walk with a shovel or seed or just the desire to breathe the clean air without looking over my shoulder. And sometimes, when the wind's just right, I swear I can hear my father's voice echo off the lake. Stand your ground, son. That's what it's there for. I did, Dad, and I always will. Because in a world where they try to take everything, time, land, dignity, the only thing that matters is what you won't let go of. And me, I won't let go of this lake, this land, this life. Not now, not ever.